Picture this. You're standing on a ridge in what we now call southern Arizona, looking out over a landscape that would kill most people in a matter of days. The Sonoran Desert stretches endlessly before you, a furnace of rock and thorn where summer temperatures climb past 110 degrees. Behind you rise the Chiricahua Mountains, their peaks capped with snow, even as the desert floor below bakes under a merciless sun. Most humans who found themselves here would see only death, no obvious water, no shade, no clear path to safety. But for the Apache peoples, this wasn't a wasteland. This was home. This was a civilization. For centuries before any European ship touched American shores, Apache bands moved through these vast territories like wind across the desert. And when I say vast, I mean truly staggering in scope. Their traditional homelands covered what we now call Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Texas, Colorado, and deep into the mountains of northern Mexico. We're talking about an area larger than France and Germany combined. The Chiricahua Apache controlled the mountain passes where Arizona, New Mexico, and Mexico meet. Think of them as the gatekeepers of the Southwest. The Mescalero dominated the Sacramento Mountains of New Mexico. The Jicarilla held the northern reaches toward Colorado. The Western Apache claimed the high country of central Arizona. Each band didn't just survive in their territory, they thrived. They knew every spring, every hidden canyon, every edible plant across thousands of square miles. When I say they knew the land, I don't mean they had a rough idea of where to find water. Apache boys learned to run 30 miles without stopping across terrain that would leave modern marathon runners crawling. They could find water where geologists today would swear none existed. They moved silently through forests of ocotillo. Imagine walking through a garden of 20-foot-tall thorns without making a sound, and across rocky ridges that would shred your boots in an hour. The women were equally remarkable. Apache girls mastered the 100 different uses of the agave plant. Think about that for a moment. 100 uses from a single desert succulent. They knew which seeds to gather in which season. Across an area the size of Texas, they could build a wickiup shelter in just a few hours that would withstand desert storms, capable of producing winds over 70 miles per hour. These weren't primitive people scratching out a bare existence. These were masters of one of Earth's most challenging environments. Their language itself reveals the sophistication of their relationship with this land. The Apache language contained over 20 distinct words for different types of rain. Not just rain or heavy rain, but specific terms for the gentle morning mist that barely dampened the ground. The violent summer thunderstorms that brought flash floods roaring through arroyos. The winter storms that painted the mountains white, and everything in between. When you have 20 words for rain, you're not just observing weather, you're reading the land like a book. When Spanish conquistadors first encountered Apache raiders in the 1500s, they met something they'd never seen before. These weren't the settled agricultural peoples of central Mexico that the Spanish knew how to conquer. These were warriors who fought from horseback with stunning skill, who appeared from nowhere like ghosts and vanished like smoke into landscapes the Spanish couldn't even navigate. The Spanish called them Apache, a Zuni word meaning the enemy, but among themselves they were the Nde, the Dine, simply the people. And what people they were. Mingas coloradas would grow to stand 6 feet 4 inches tall in an era when the average height was closer to 5.5 feet. He was a giant who united the Mimbreno band through a combination of wisdom, strength, and political brilliance that would have impressed Machiavelli. Gochis of the Chiricahua possessed such tactical genius that he would one day hold off the entire United States Army with a few hundred warriors. Yungoyakla, later known to the world as Geronimo, learned the sacred songs that Apache believed gave warriors supernatural power in battle. Their economy balanced perfectly on 4 pillars, each as important as the others. First came hunting, deer and antelope that they tracked across vast distances with an understanding of animal behavior that bordered on the mystical. Second was gathering the desert's seasonal bounty, everything from pine nuts in the mountains to prickly pear fruit in the lowlands, harvested according to cycles their ancestors had perfected over countless generations. Third was trading with Pueblo peoples and Mexican settlements, exchanging Apache-made goods and surplus food for items they couldn't produce themselves. And fourth, here's where it gets complicated for modern sensibilities, was raiding. To Apache thinking, raiding wasn't random violence or senseless cruelty. It was an ancient rite, a way young men proved themselves while redistributing wealth from those who had excess to those who needed it. They took horses, cattle, and goods, but they rarely killed unless they met with resistance. In their worldview, this made perfect sense. The land provided for everyone, but some people hoarded while others went without. Raiding corrected that imbalance. This practice, so logical within their cultural framework, would bring them into inevitable collision with expanding American power. But in those centuries before that collision, Apache bands created something remarkable. A civilization that could flourish in lands others considered uninhabitable. A people who turned the harshest environment in North America into home. They were lords of mountain and desert, masters of a domain that stretched beyond horizons. They had no idea that steam-powered ships were already bringing a different kind of people to distant shores. People who would look at this same landscape and see not a living homeland filled with the spirits of ancestors, but empty wilderness, waiting for what they called civilization. The collision between these two worlds would reshape the American Southwest forever. And it would begin with gold. The 1840s brought a wave of Americans flooding into Apache lands like nothing anyone had seen before. Picture gold miners from California spilling eastward into the Pinos Altos Mountains of New Mexico, their picks and shovels tearing into sacred earth where Apache ancestors were buried. Imagine mail routes carved across the desert, with stagecoaches rumbling through canyons, where Apache families had gathered medicinal plants for generations. Water sources that had sustained Apache communities for centuries suddenly sprouted American settlements, their wells and dams turning ancient springs into private property, where Apache peoples saw a living landscape filled with the spirits of ancestors. Americans saw empty wilderness waiting for civilization. This wasn't just a difference of opinion. It was a collision between two completely incompatible ways of understanding the world itself. To Apache thinking, you couldn't own land any more than you could own the wind or the clouds. The land was alive, sacred, filled with power and history. To American thinking, unused land was wasted opportunity, and Apache territories looked magnificently unused. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 transferred Apache homelands from Mexico to the United States, with no consideration whatsoever for the people who actually lived there. Think about that for a moment. Two foreign governments signed a piece of paper in a distant city, and suddenly Apache families who had lived in the same canyons for generations became trespassers in their own homeland. No Apache leader was consulted. No Apache voice was heard. One day, they were living in Mexican territory, where they'd negotiated informal arrangements for generations. The next day, they were living in American territory, where they had no legal standing at all. Mangus Coloradas attempted diplomacy first. This towering chief, this giant among his people, approached American miners at Pinos Altos in 1851, hoping to negotiate shared use of the land. Here was a leader who had united Apache bands, who commanded respect across thousands of square miles of territory, coming in peace to work out an arrangement that could benefit everyone. The miners tied him to a tree and whipped him nearly to death. Let that sink in for a moment. They took one of the most powerful leaders in the Southwest, a man who could have brought war down on every American settlement from the Rio Grande to the Colorado River, and they humiliated him like a common criminal. This wasn't just brutality, it was stupidity of breathtaking proportions. That whipping transformed Mangus Coloradas from a potential ally into an implacable enemy. From that moment forward, the great chief would dedicate his life to driving every American from Apache lands. His son-in-law, Cochise, maintained fragile peace for nearly a decade longer. But that peace shattered in 1861 at a place called Apache Pass. The incident began with a false accusation. American soldiers blamed Cochise for kidnapping a white boy named Felix Ward, though the boy had actually been taken by a different Apache band entirely. Cochise came to parley under a white flag, bringing his brother, 2 nephews, and his young son to meet with Lieutenant George Bascom at the Butterfield stage station. Bascom had already decided Cochise was guilty. When the Apache chief explained that his people hadn't taken the boy and offered to help find the real kidnappers, Bascom attempted to arrest him. Picture the scene. Cochise sitting in an army tent, suddenly realizing that the Americans had lured him into a trap. In one fluid motion he drew his knife, cut through the tent wall, and escaped into the rocks outside. But his brother and nephews remained prisoners. What followed was a tragic spiral of violence that neither side could stop. Cochise captured Americans to trade for his relatives. Bascom refused to negotiate. Both sides executed their prisoners. The Apache Wars had begun, and they would rage for 25 years. The Apache Wars featured brilliant military minds on both sides locked in a deadly chess match across some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. Cochise turned the Dragoon Mountains into an impregnable fortress, using signal fires and mirror flashes to coordinate attacks across vast distances. His warriors could appear anywhere within a 100-mile radius, strike like lightning, and vanish into canyons where pursuing cavalry would find nothing but empty wind and echoing hoofbeats. General George Crook, whom Apaches called Grey Wolf, learned to fight Apache style rather than relying on conventional military tactics. He abandoned the slow-moving wagon trains that made easy targets and used mule trains instead. Most importantly, he employed Apache scouts, warriors from bands already on reservations who knew every rock and water hole in the territory. Crook understood what many American commanders never grasped. You couldn't defeat the Apache using European military tactics any more than you could defeat the ocean using cavalry charges. Victorio of the Warm Springs. Apache led perhaps the most epic fighting retreat in American military history. In 1879, he broke out of the San Carlos Reservation with 300 followers and led them on an 1,800-mile running battle across New Mexico, Texas, and Mexico. Think about that distance, from New York City to Denver. For over a year, Victorio evaded thousands of soldiers from 2 nations, striking when conditions favored him, disappearing when they didn't. Mexican forces finally cornered and killed him at Tres Castillos in 1880. But not before he'd proven that Apache tactical genius could confound the armies of 2 modern nations. But the most legendary campaigns belonged to Geronimo. After Mexican soldiers slaughtered his family in 1851, he received a vision during a ceremony that granted him power in warfare. The vision told him that bullets could not kill him, and that he would know the future in battle. Whether you believe in such things or not, Geronimo certainly believed, and that belief made him virtually unstoppable for 30 years. His final breakout from the San Carlos Reservation in 1885 triggered the largest manhunt in American military history. Picture this: Geronimo fled with just 35 warriors, including women and children. Against them, the United States deployed 5,000 troops, roughly 140 soldiers for every Apache warrior. Mexico added 3,000 more soldiers. 500 Apache scouts joined the hunt. That's over 8,000 men chasing 35 people across the Sierra Madre Mountains. For over a year, this tiny band evaded capture while covering thousands of miles of desert and mountain terrain. They struck ranches and settlements on both sides of the border, captured fresh horses when they needed them, and vanished into wilderness that their pursuers couldn't navigate. Modern military analysts study Geronimo's campaign as a masterpiece of guerrilla warfare. But at the time, it drove American commanders to distraction. Geronimo surrendered only when General Nelson Miles promised that his people could return to Arizona after a brief exile in the East. The promise was a lie, But Geronimo couldn't know that. He'd fought longer and harder than any other Apache leader, but even he couldn't fight forever. On September 4th, 1886, he walked into Miles' camp and laid down his rifle. The Apache wars were over, but the real tragedy was just beginning. On September 8, 1886, soldiers loaded Geronimo and 383 Apache men, women, and children onto trains bound for Florida. Warriors who had never traveled faster than a horse could run sat in bewilderment as the landscape blurred past windows. Children who had known only desert mountains stared at endless plains, then forests, then swamps that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. At fuel stops, crowds gathered to gawk at the savage Geronimo, and enterprising guards charged 25 cents for people to take photographs with the legendary warrior. Imagine the psychological shock of that journey. These were people whose entire identity was tied to specific places, particular springs, certain mountain peaks, family burial sites in hidden canyons. Apache children learned the landscape like other children learned to read, memorizing every landmark and water source across thousands of square miles. Now they watched their entire world disappear behind them as the train carried them toward a future they couldn't comprehend. Fort Marion in St. Augustine became their first prison, an ancient Spanish fortress where warriors who had roamed territories larger than most European countries found themselves confined to dank stone cells. The humid, suffocating air of Florida felt like drowning to people from the arid Southwest. Their bodies, adapted to high desert conditions, couldn't cope with the moisture and heat. Mosquitoes brought malaria and other diseases that Apache immune systems had no resistance to. Within months, dozens were dead. The cultural destruction was even more devastating than the physical suffering. Children were ripped from their parents and sent to places like Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. Part of a national program designed to kill the Indian, save the man. At Carlisle, Apache children had their long hair shorn the moment they arrived. Their names were replaced with English ones chosen by teachers who couldn't pronounce Apache words. Speaking their own language brought beatings. Wearing traditional clothing brought punishment. Everything their parents had taught them, every story, every song, every prayer was forbidden. The physical structures of captivity bewildered the Apache prisoners as much as the rules. "We have real beds," they said to each other, not in celebration but in confusion. These raised platforms with cloth mattresses separated them from the earth that had always been their sleeping companion. In Apache tradition, you slept on the ground to stay connected to the living world beneath you. These beds created a barrier between prisoners, and the only thing that remained constant, the earth itself. Walls blocked the movement of air and spirit. Scheduled meal times replaced eating when hungry, breaking the natural rhythm that connected Apache people to the cycles of sun and season. Uniforms replaced clothing that told family history through every bead and pattern. At Carlisle, Apache children slept in iron beds lined up like soldiers, ate at long tables in enforced silence, and marched to classes where they learned to be ashamed of everything their parents had taught them. Meanwhile, the reservation at San Carlos in Arizona, where other Apache bands were forcibly concentrated, earned the nickname Hell's 40 Acres. Summer temperatures regularly reached 115 degrees. The Gila River ran brown with alkali water that caused chronic dysentery. Government agents forced warriors to become farmers in soil that turned to concrete under the desert sun, while the decent farmland along the river was already claimed by white settlers who'd arrived first. Traditional foods disappeared as people became dependent on government rations of white flour and rancid beef. The spiritual connection to land that had sustained Apache culture for centuries was severed. Sacred sites became off-limits. Traditional ceremonies were outlawed. Apache scouts who had helped track Geronimo discovered that their service to the United States Army earned them no better treatment. They too lost their weapons, their horses, their freedom to move. The system seemed designed to break not just Apache resistance, but Apache identity itself. and for a time it nearly succeeded. Children who returned from boarding schools spoke English better than Apache. Young people who had never learned to track deer or gather desert plants found themselves trapped between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. The great leaders were aging and dying in exile, their wisdom seemingly dying with them. But appearances can be deceiving. In the darkness of cultural destruction, something remarkable was happening. In the darkness of those years when everything Apache seemed to be dying, Apache grandmothers became warriors of a different kind. They whispered traditional stories to children in boarding schools, embedding ancient lessons in tales of Coyote the trickster that white teachers dismissed as harmless folklore. These weren't just stories. They were survival instructions disguised as entertainment, teaching children how to think like Apache even when they weren't allowed to speak like Apache. Medicine men disguised healing ceremonies as social gatherings, keeping alive knowledge of plants and prayers that government agents had declared illegal. When officials saw Apache families gathering to share food and conversation, they didn't realize they were witnessing sacred rituals that connected people to powers older than any reservation boundary. Women wove history into baskets, preserving memory in patterns that outsiders saw only as decoration. Each design told a story, encoded knowledge, maintained connections that barbed wire couldn't sever. The Apache language itself became an act of resistance. It evolved, creating new words for the strange artifacts of white civilization, while maintaining the deep, grammatical structures that connected people to land and spirit. Children learned to be bilingual in more than just English and Apache. They learned to speak one way in school and another way at home, to show one face to authorities and another to family. Reservation boundaries that were meant to imprison became shields behind which Apache culture slowly regenerated. Leaders like Daklugi, Geronimo's nephew, learned to navigate American legal systems, fighting in courtrooms for rights that had been denied on battlefields. They discovered that the same legal framework that had stripped away Apache lands could sometimes be used to protect what remained. The 1887 Dawes Act, intended to break up tribal lands by forcing individual ownership, was resisted and subverted by Apache leaders who understood its true purpose. When the government tried to turn communal tribal property into individual plots that could be sold to white buyers, Apache families found ways to keep their land within the community. When Native American religion was officially outlawed by federal authorities, Apache ceremonies continued in secret locations, with practitioners risking imprisonment to maintain the spiritual connections that defined their people. The 20th century brought new forms of resistance and revival that would have amazed those who'd predicted Apache extinction. Apache men who fought in World War I returned home as decorated veterans, their service forcing America to confront the contradiction of heroes who couldn't vote in their own country. How do you deny citizenship to someone who'd bled for the flag at Belleau Wood? Apache veterans from World War II came home with even stronger claims to full American rights, having fought fascism abroad while their families remained confined to reservations. At home, the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 and the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 provided new tools that Apache leaders wielded with the same skill their ancestors had shown with war clubs and rifles. They learned to use federal bureaucracy against itself to turn American law into weapons for Apache survival. Tribal constitutions became shields protecting sovereignty. Federal recognition became armor-deflecting state interference. The 1960s brought the American Indian movement and a new generation of Apache activists who combined traditional values with modern tactics. They occupied government buildings, filed federal lawsuits, and used television cameras as effectively as their great-grandfathers had used signal mirrors. Apache college students, educated in universities their parents couldn't have imagined attending, returned to reservations with law, degrees and medical degrees in engineering, degrees armed with knowledge that could protect their people in ways that Rifles never could. Gaming compacts signed in the 1990s transformed reservation economies almost overnight. Casinos that seemed to mock traditional Apache values actually generated revenues that funded language programs, cultural centers, and college scholarships. The money that flowed from slot machines paid for Apache language immersion programs, teaching children words their great-grandparents had been beaten for speaking. Today, the San Carlos Apache tribe, White Mountain Apache tribe, Mescalero Apache tribe, and others stand as sovereign nations within the United States. Apache-owned ski resorts generate millions in revenue from snow sports in the same mountains where Cochise once hid from cavalry. Apache casinos and timber operations provide economic independence that would have been impossible under the old reservation system. Young Apache doctors, trained at reservation-funded medical schools, return to serve communities their ancestors died defending. Language immersion programs teach children not just Apache words, but Apache ways of thinking about the world. Sacred mountains once lost to mining companies return to tribal control through legal victories, and land purchases that cost millions but restore connections worth far more than money. The real beds that once symbolized captivity now exist alongside traditional wiki-ups built for ceremonies, reminding everyone that walls and boundaries could not contain the Apache spirit. From Geronimo's surrender in 1886 to today's tribal sovereignty, the Apache peoples have traveled a journey that would have seemed impossible to those who watched the trains carry prisoners toward Florida. They have proven that survival itself can be a form of victory, that cultures can bend without breaking, that the word unconquered means something deeper than winning battles. The Apache story isn't over. It continues in every child who learns traditional stories, in every ceremony that connects the living to the ancestors, in every legal victory that protects sacred sites from development. The lords of mountain and desert remain lords still, ruling not through force of arms, but through force of will, proving that some things are stronger than armies, more durable than empires, more enduring than the very stones of the earth they've called home for countless generations. The trains that once carried Apache prisoners to exile now carry Apache business leaders to conferences, Apache students to universities, Apache athletes to competitions around the world. But they always come home to the mountains and deserts that shaped them, carrying with them the unbroken chain of knowledge and tradition that survived everything America could throw against it. That is the true measure of Apache victory. Not that they stopped the trains, but that they learned to ride them without losing themselves along the way.